The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows of her father's study, casting long shadows across mountains of paper that had accumulated over 43 years of obsessive organization. Sarah Chen stood in the doorway, 34 years old, recently unemployed, recently divorced, and now recently orphaned, staring at the filing system that had defined her father's entire adult life. Metal cabinets lined every wall from floor to ceiling. 19 of them, each one labeled with Thomas Chen's meticulous handwriting in categories that made sense only to him. The labels read like fragments of a private language. Municipal Bonds 1979 to 1983, Railroad Stock Certificates, Utility Dividends Pre-Deregulation, Insurance Policy Amendments, Property Deed Modifications. Each drawer stuffed so full that some wouldn't close completely, their contents bulging against the metal frames like organs pressing against ribs. Her father had died 3 weeks ago. Pancreatic cancer, quick and merciless, taking him from diagnosis to funeral in 78 days. He'd spent his final conscious moments not saying goodbye or sharing wisdom, but trying to explain something about the filing system that Sarah couldn't understand through the morphine haze and her own exhausted grief. His last words had been check the bottom drawer, but he'd never specified which cabinet, which section, which of the hundreds of drawers that filled this room like a maze of forgotten paper. Sarah's phone buzzed. Text from her sister Michelle, who lived in Singapore and hadn't bothered to fly back for the funeral. Estate lawyer says we need to clear the house by end of month. Just throw out Dad's paper hoarding. None of it's worth anything. Get the house listed ASAP. She closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of Michelle's dismissal. Her sister had always been the practical one, the successful one, the one who'd escaped their father's eccentricities by putting an ocean between herself and the cramped house in Sacramento, where Thomas Chen had spent 4 decades working as a mid-level insurance adjuster and collecting paper like some people collected stamps or coins. The house itself was worth maybe $400,000 in Sacramento's inflated market. After the mortgage was paid and the estate settled, Sarah and Michelle would split perhaps $200,000 each. Enough to solve some problems. Not enough to solve all of them. Certainly not enough to justify the month of sorting through a dead man's filing obsession. Another text, this time from her ex-husband David. Lawyer says you're late on the mediation payment again. This is getting ridiculous. Sarah, you promised you'd have it handled. She turned off her phone and sat down in her father's chair, the worn leather creaking under her weight. The desk in front of her was the only clear surface in the entire room, kept pristine as if Thomas Chen had needed one space free of his own compulsions. A photograph sat in a silver frame, faded with age. Sarah at 7, Michelle at 10, their mother still alive, all of them smiling at the beach before cancer took their mother and transformed their father from a warm, occasionally absent-minded man into someone who channeled his grief into categorical systems and paper trails. She picked up the photograph, studying her younger self. That little girl had believed her father was brilliant, had sat on his lap while he explained the importance of documentation, of keeping records, of never trusting memory when paper could preserve truth. Now, looking at the filing cabinets that entombed his life's work, she wondered whether he'd been brilliant or just broken. The doorbell rang, pulling her from the photograph. She set it down carefully and walked through the narrow hallway to the front door. Through the peephole, she saw Karen Wu, her father's neighbor for 20 years, holding a casserole dish. Sarah opened the door, managing a smile. Karen, you didn't have to. Karen stepped inside without waiting for invitation, her eyes immediately scanning the interior with a practiced assessment of someone who'd been watching the house decline for years. I made too much anyway. How are you holding up? I'm fine, just sorting through Dad's things. Karen set the casserole on the kitchen counter, then turned to face Sarah with the expression of someone preparing to deliver uncomfortable truth wrapped in compassion. Sarah, honey, I need to be honest with you. Your father was a sweet man, but he wasn't well toward the end. Not mentally. Sarah felt her jaw tighten. He had cancer, Karen. That's physical, not mental. I'm talking about before the diagnosis. Karen's voice softened, but her words didn't. The last few years, he became obsessed. He'd talk about important documents, about hidden value in his filing system, about how no one understood what he'd been doing all these years. He'd knock on my door at odd hours, insisting he needed to tell me something about his files, but then he'd get confused and forget what he wanted to say. Sarah's throat constricted. She'd noticed her father's confusion during those final months, the way he'd repeat himself, the way simple conversations would loop back to his filing system as if everything important in life could be reduced to properly categorized paper. Karen continued, her hand finding Sarah's arm with practiced sympathy. I know this is hard to hear, but that filing system was just his way of coping with your mother's death. It gave him control when everything else felt chaotic, but it doesn't mean there's anything valuable there. It's just paper, sweetie. Decades of paper that a grieving man couldn't let go of. I know, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. The kindest thing you could do is hire a junk removal service. Don't torture yourself going through every drawer. Your father would understand. Karen squeezed her arm once more, then moved toward the door. I'm here if you need anything. But please, don't waste your time chasing whatever confused ideas he had near the end. After Karen left, Sarah returned to the study. The filing cabinets seemed larger now, more oppressive, their metal surfaces reflecting the afternoon light in harsh angles. She pulled open the nearest drawer, labeled Correspondence 1981 to 1985. Inside, letters were organized by date, each one slipped into a clear plastic sleeve, each sleeve labeled with sender, subject, and Thomas Chen's assessment of importance on a scale of 1 to 10. She lifted out a random letter. A response from Sacramento Municipal Utilities about a billing dispute from 1983. Her father had rated it as 7 and included 3 pages of supporting documentation, cross-reference to another file about utility rate adjustments. Sarah closed the drawer and moved to the next cabinet, then the next. Each one revealed the same meticulous madness. Documents sorted, labeled, preserved, cross-referenced, rated, and stored with a precision that suggested deep intelligence applied to ultimately meaningless tasks. By evening, she'd opened 20 drawers and found nothing except proof that Karen was right. This wasn't a filing system. It was a monument to grief disguised as organization. Her father had spent 40 years creating the illusion of order because he couldn't control the chaos that had taken his wife. She sat back down at the desk, exhausted and hungry, the casserole Karen had brought still untouched in the kitchen. The photograph of her family stared at her, frozen in a moment before everything collapsed. She picked it up again, studying her father's face. He'd been happy then, or at least he'd worn happiness better than he'd worn the grief that came after. Her phone, which she'd turned back on, buzzed with new messages. Michelle, did you call the junk removal people yet? David, I'm serious about the payment deadline. Her best friend Alicia, how's it going? Do you need me to come help? She didn't respond to any of them. Instead, she opened her father's desk drawer, looking for nothing in particular, just touching his things as if proximity to his possessions might reveal something words had failed to communicate. Inside the drawer, she found his daily planner from the year he died. The entries were sparse near the end, just doctor's appointments and medication reminders. But months earlier, when he'd still been healthy, the entries were dense. Meeting notes, task lists, reminders to check specific files. One entry, dated 6 months before his diagnosis, caught her attention. Written in his careful handwriting, verify bottom drawer authentication. Contact Phillips regarding 1952 originals. Appraisal needed before disclosure. Sarah frowned, reading it again. Phillips? She didn't know anyone by that name. And what originals from 1952? Her father would have been 8 years old in 1952. She flipped back through earlier pages. More cryptic notes appeared, scattered among mundane reminders. Cross-reference grandfather certificates with modern valuations. Research authentication requirements for pre-1960 bonds. Document provenance for Michelle and Sarah's inheritance. Her pulse quickened. These weren't the confused ramblings Karen had described. These were purposeful notes, technical and specific, suggesting her father had been working on something concrete, something he'd wanted to preserve for his daughters. She turned to the filing cabinets with new attention, studying the labels more carefully. Most were straightforward, but a few seemed oddly vague. One cabinet in the far corner, partially hidden behind her father's desk chair, bore labels that didn't match the others. Instead of date ranges and document types, these drawers were marked with single words: foundation, legacy, authentication, provenance. Sarah stood and moved the chair aside, revealing the cabinet fully. It was older than the others, its metal surface showing rust spots near the corners, its finish faded to a dull gray. She tried the top drawer. Locked. She tried the next one. Also locked. All 5 drawers were locked, and she didn't see any keys. She returned to the desk drawer, searching more carefully now. Beneath the planner, she found a small manila envelope sealed with yellowed tape. She opened it carefully, and 3 keys fell in her palm, each one labeled with Thomas Chen's handwriting: foundation, legacy, authentication. Her hands trembled slightly as she returned to the locked cabinet. She inserted the key labeled foundation into the top drawer and turned it. The lock clicked, resistance giving way, and the drawer rolled open with a metallic groan that seemed too loud in the quiet room. Inside, the organization was different from the other cabinets. Instead of plastic sleeves and cross-references, she found old leather portfolios, the kind bankers use in movies set in the 1940s. Each portfolio was tied with a faded ribbon, and each bore a small card in her father's handwriting. Grandfather's collection, original documents. Handle with care. Sarah lifted out the first portfolio, her pulse accelerating. She untied the ribbon carefully, the old fabric crumbling slightly under her fingers. The portfolio opened to reveal documents slipped into individual sleeves, but these weren't letters or utility bills. These were certificates printed on heavy paper with elaborate borders and official seals. She lifted the first one carefully. A railroad bond issued in 1893 by the Central Pacific Railroad Company. Face value, $10,000. The paper felt substantial, aged but well-preserved, the printing still crisp despite its age. Her father had attached a small note, part of Grandfather Chen's investment portfolio. Purchased 1932 during Depression. Verify current status. Sarah set it aside and examined the next document. Another bond, this one from Western Union Telegraph Company, dated 1901, face value $5,000. Then another from American Telephone and Telegraph, 1898, $20,000. Then stock certificates for companies she'd never heard of, Consolidated Edison predecessor companies, pre-merger railroad operations, early utility consortiums. She worked through the portfolio slowly, her breath catching with each new discovery. By the time she reached the last document, she'd counted 47 separate certificates and bonds, their combined face values totaling over 300,000 in turn-of-the-century dollars. But face value meant nothing without knowing whether the companies still existed, whether the bonds had ever been redeemed, whether the certificates represented anything more than historical curiosities. She set the first portfolio aside and reached for the second one. This portfolio was thicker, heavier. Inside, she found more certificates, but these were accompanied by authentication documents, appraisal reports dated from the 1970s, and correspondence with securities firms. Her father hadn't just preserved these documents. He'd been researching them, documenting their provenance, tracking their potential value. One letter, dated 1978, was from a securities expert at Goldman Sachs. Sarah read it slowly, her heart hammering. Dear Mr. Chen, regarding your inquiry about the railroad bonds inherited from your grandfather, I can confirm that many of these securities remain valid and unclaimed. The Central Pacific bonds were merged into Union Pacific Holdings and have continued to accrue interest through subsequent corporate restructurings. Current estimated value, pending authentication and proper claim filing, would be substantial. I recommend you retain legal counsel specializing in historical securities before proceeding. The letter went on, discussing technical details about bond redemption, corporate successor liability, and authentication requirements. At the bottom, her father had written in pencil, "Waited too long." Need to organize provenance for daughters before taking action. Sarah sat down on the floor, the portfolio still in her lap, trying to process what she was reading. Her father hadn't been hoarding meaningless paper. He'd been protecting something valuable, researching it, documenting it, preparing to pass it to his daughters, but running out of time before he could explain. She reached for the third portfolio, but her hands were shaking now, anticipation and disbelief fighting for dominance. This one contained more modern documents, appraisals from the 1990s, legal opinions about securities law, and a handwritten summary in her father's careful script. For Michelle and Sarah, your great-grandfather, Chen, immigrated from Guangdong province in 1886 and worked on railroad construction. He saved every dollar, invested during the 1893 financial panic when others were selling, and accumulated these certificates over 40 years. When he died in 1932, he left them to my father, your grandfather, who gave them to me in 1965 with instructions to preserve them for future generations. I have spent my adult life documenting their authenticity and tracking their value through corporate mergers, bankruptcies, and restructurings. Many of these securities have been forgotten by the companies that issued them, but the debt obligations remain legally valid. Others have been folded into modern corporations through complex chains of acquisition. I tried to cash them in several times, but the process was overwhelming and I was afraid of making mistakes that might invalidate the claims. I needed more time to organize the documentation properly. Time ran out. If you're reading this, I'm gone. The authentication documents are in the drawer marked authentication. The legal research is in provenance. The modern appraisals are in legacy. Everything you need to claim what your great-grandfather built is here. I'm sorry I didn't explain this while I was alive. I kept thinking I had more time. I kept thinking I could hand you a complete, perfect package instead of making you work through my filing system. I was wrong. Check the bottom drawer. That's where I put the most valuable pieces. The ones I was too afraid to lose. I love you both. Make your great-grandfather proud. Dad, Sarah's vision blurred with tears. She wiped her eyes roughly, smearing dust across her cheek, and stared at the letter her father had written but never sent, filed away in a drawer he'd hoped his daughters would find. All those years of obsessive organization hadn't been madness. They'd been love, expressed in the only language Thomas Chen knew after grief took his words. She stood up, legs unsteady, and looked at the locked cabinet with new understanding. 5 drawers, 3 keys already used, 2 more to go. The drawer marked authentication would contain proof that these certificates were real. The drawer marked legacy would show their modern value. But first, she needed to find the bottom drawer her father had mentioned in his letter and in his final confused words. She scanned the cabinet labels again, looking for anything that might indicate which drawer he meant. Then she noticed something she'd missed before. The cabinet her father had called Foundation had 6 drawers, not 5. The 6th one, at the very bottom, was smaller than the others, almost hidden by the shadow cast by the cabinet's base. It wasn't labeled at all. Sarah knelt down, running her fingers along the drawer's edge. It looked different from the others, newer maybe, or modified. She tried to pull it open. Locked. She checked the keys in her hand. 3 keys, 3 drawers already opened, but this bottom drawer needed something else. She returned to her father's desk, searching through every compartment, every envelope, every corner. Nothing. She checked his filing system drawers, the ones she'd already opened, looking for a key hidden among the papers. Still nothing. Frustrated, she sat back in her father's chair and forced herself to think. If Thomas Chen had locked this drawer separately, he would have left the key somewhere obvious, somewhere his daughters would find it without having to tear apart the house. Somewhere meaningful. Her eyes fell on the photograph, still sitting on the desk. The silver frame, warm afternoon light reflecting off its surface. She picked it up, studying not just the image but the frame itself. It felt heavier than it should. She turned it over. The backing was held in place with small metal tabs, old and slightly bent. She pried them open carefully and lifted the backing away. Behind the photograph, taped to the inside of the frame, was a small brass key. Sarah's breath caught. She removed the key carefully, her father's foresight both brilliant and heartbreaking. He'd hidden it with the one object his daughters would never throw away, the last family photograph before their mother died. She knelt again at the bottom drawer, inserted the key, and turned it. The lock clicked, smoother than the others, newer. The drawer rolled open. Inside, unlike the portfolios and documents in the upper drawers, she found a single leather-bound box, roughly the size of a large book. The leather was worn but well-maintained, its brass corners tarnished with age. A small brass plate on top bore an engraving. Chen Family Trust, 1952. Sarah lifted the box carefully and set it on the floor beside her. The lid opened easily, revealing a collection of documents arranged in chronological order. Each one slipped into an archival sleeve. The first document was a letter dated 1952, written in Chinese characters with English translation clipped beside it. Sarah read the translation. To my son Thomas, I am dying, and there are things you must know about our family's fortune. In 1932, when Americans were desperate and selling everything, I bought their paper. Bonds, certificates, shares in companies they thought would never recover. I paid pennies on the dollar for securities worth thousands. Your mother thought I was foolish, wasting our savings on worthless paper. But I knew the companies would survive. Infrastructure doesn't disappear. Railroads keep running. Power companies keep generating electricity. Telephones keep connecting people. The paper might lose value, but the assets behind the paper remain. I have kept these certificates hidden and safe for 20 years, waiting for you to be old enough to understand their value. When I am gone, you must protect them as I have protected them. You must wait for the right time to claim what they represent. You must pass them to your children as I pass them to you. Do not rush. Do not trust anyone who says the paper is worthless. Companies hide debts they no longer want to pay. They hope bondholders forget. You must not forget. You must remember, and your children must remember, and their children must remember. This is our family's legacy, built from patience and faith when others had neither. Your father, Chun Wei. Sarah set down the letter, her hands trembling. She looked at the other documents in the box. Behind Chun Wei's letter were stock certificates printed on elaborate paper with ornate borders and seals that looked like something from a museum. But these weren't displayed under glass. These were real, tangible, legally binding instruments. She lifted the first certificate. Consolidated Edison Company, predecessor to Con Edison, issued 1947, 1,000 shares. The market value printed on the certificate was $10 per share. Sarah's mind raced, trying to calculate what those shares might be worth now after 76 years of splits, dividends, and appreciation. The next certificate made her breath stop entirely. American Telephone and Telegraph Company, issued 1952, 5,000 shares. AT&T before the breakup, before the mergers, before the telecommunications industry transformed into what it was today. Her father had attached a small note. Verify successor companies after 1984 breakup. Track through all subsequent mergers. All dividend rights should have been preserved. She continued through the box, each document more significant than the last. Railroad bonds that had been folded into Berkshire Hathaway Holdings. Utility company shares that became parts of modern energy conglomerates. Banking certificates that survived the Depression and became pieces of institutions too big to fail. At the bottom of the box, she found a thick envelope marked Summary Appraisal. 2019, for Sarah and Michelle. Her father's handwriting, but recent, done just months before his diagnosis. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a professional appraisal from Phillips Securities Authentication, the firm he'd mentioned in his planner. The document was 40 pages long, detailing each certificate's provenance, tracking its value through corporate history, documenting authentication procedures and legal precedent for claiming forgotten securities. The final page contained a summary table. Sarah's eyes scanned down the columns, her brain struggling to process the numbers. Individual securities valued in the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands. Some of the railroad bonds, tracked through multiple corporate successions, were valued in the millions. At the bottom, in bold print, the total estimated value, $197,400,000. $197,400,000. Sarah stared at the number, certain she was misreading it. She checked again. The decimal point was in the right place. The math was correct. After authentication, legal claim filing, and proper successor company notification, the Chen family certificates could be worth nearly $200 million. She set the appraisal down carefully, as if it might disappear if handled roughly, and looked around the study with new eyes. The filing cabinets she dismissed as hoarding were actually a complex authentication system. The papers she'd thought were worthless were actually carefully preserved documentation proving ownership, tracking corporate successions, establishing unbroken chains of title from 1893 to today. Her father hadn't been crazy. He'd been protecting something extraordinary, building a case for his daughter's future one meticulously filed document at a time. Sarah sat in silence, the appraisal in her lap, surrounded by filing cabinets full of proof that her family wasn't poor, wasn't ordinary, wasn't forgotten. They were the heirs to a fortune accumulated by a Chinese immigrant who'd bet everything on America's future when Americans themselves had lost faith. The afternoon had shifted into evening. The study had grown dim. She should turn on lights, should call Michelle, should call the lawyer, should do something besides sit on the floor of her dead father's study, holding an appraisal that said her life was about to change forever. But she couldn't move. She couldn't speak. She could only stare at the numbers and think about her father spending 43 years preparing this gift, organizing this inheritance, protecting this legacy, while everyone around him thought he was wasting his life on meaningless paper. Karen had called it hoarding. Michelle had called it junk. Even Sarah had thought it was just grief turned into compulsion. They'd all been wrong. Thomas Chen hadn't been broken by his wife's death. He'd been driven by it to complete the mission his father had given him, to preserve what his grandfather had built, to pass to his daughters what 3 generations of Chen men had protected against time, skepticism, and the corporate machinery that preferred forgotten debts to honored obligations. Sarah picked up the photograph from the desk, the one that had hidden the key. She looked at her father's face, seeing him differently now. Not as the absent-minded man who'd embarrassed her with his filing obsession, but as someone who'd loved his daughters so much that he'd spent his entire adult life building them a future he knew they couldn't imagine. "I found it, Dad," she whispered to the photograph. "I found the bottom drawer." Outside, the Sacramento evening had turned golden, the lights streaming through the dusty windows and shafts that illuminated the filing cabinets like reliquaries holding sacred texts. Sarah stood slowly, her legs stiff from sitting on the floor, and walked to the window. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had. Modest houses on quiet streets. Nothing suggesting that one of those houses held a fortune built by a railroad worker who'd believed in tomorrow when everyone else had given up. She pulled out her phone and stared at Michelle's messages demanding she throw everything away. She thought about calling her sister right now, explaining what she'd found, sharing the discovery that would change both their lives. But something stopped her. The appraisal was dated 6 months ago. Her father had commissioned it while he was healthy, when he'd still had time to explain everything. He'd never showed it to them. He'd filed it away in the bottom drawer with specific instructions about which drawers to check first, which documents to review, which sequence to follow. He'd made them earn this discovery, perhaps wanting them to understand the work he'd done, the value of his obsessive organization, the love embedded in every labeled drawer and cross-reference file. If she called Michelle now, her sister would immediately start talking about lawyers, about liquidation, about splitting the money and moving on. Michelle wouldn't appreciate the journey, wouldn't understand what their father had been trying to teach them by making them search through his filing system to find the truth. Sarah decided to wait. Not long, but long enough to understand everything herself first, to read through all the authentication documents, to trace the corporate successions their father had mapped, to follow his research and see the brilliant mind that had tracked these securities through decades of American financial history. She returned to the cabinet and unlocked the drawer marked authentication. Inside, she found binder after binder of research, corporate merger documents, securities law reference materials, chain of title analyses, expert opinions for financial historians. Each binder was labeled with the certificate it authenticated, each one containing proof that the paper in the bottom drawer represented real value, real claims, real obligations that living companies still owed. Her father had done everything except file the actual claims. She understood why now. The process would be complex, expensive, time-consuming. It would require lawyers specializing in historical securities, accountants understanding pre-1960 financial instruments, and researchers tracing corporate successions through multiple jurisdictions. Thomas Chen had been one man with a day job and limited resources. He'd done what he could, preserved the documents, proved their authenticity, and documented everything so his daughters would have the proof they needed when the time came. That time was now. Sarah pulled out the appraisal again and read through it more carefully. Phillips Securities Authentication had not only valued the certificates, but provided detailed recommendations for filing claims. They'd identified which modern corporations were liable for each historical security, which law firms specialized in these cases, and what documentation would be required. They'd essentially created a roadmap for turning paper into money. The firm's contact information was printed at the bottom. Sarah checked her watch. After business hours, but she composed an email anyway, introducing herself as Thomas Chen's daughter and requesting a meeting to discuss moving forward with claims on the authenticated securities. She attached photos of several certificates and hit send before she could second-guess herself. Then she sat back, exhaled slowly, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she discovered. She'd walked into this house expecting to spend a month throwing away a dead man's delusions. Instead, she'd uncovered a fortune and, more importantly, she'd understood her father in a way she never had while he was alive. The filing system hadn't been crazy. It had been love. The obsession hadn't been meaningless. It had been protection. The man she'd thought had disappeared into grief after her mother died had actually been there all along, working quietly to build something extraordinary for his daughters, too focused on the future to explain the present. Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, expecting Michelle or David or someone demanding something from her. Instead, it was an auto reply from Phillips Securities Authentication. Thank you for your inquiry. Your message has been marked urgent and forwarded to senior authentication specialists. Someone will contact you within 24 hours. 24 hours. By tomorrow, she'd be talking to experts about filing claims worth nearly $200 million. By next week, lawyers would be involved. By next month, her life would be unrecognizable. She should feel excited, relieved, vindicated. Instead, she felt an overwhelming sadness that her father wasn't here to see it. He'd done all the work, solved all the puzzles, cleared all the obstacles. But he died before the victory, before his daughters could thank him, before he could see their faces when they realized what he'd given them. Sarah walked to the desk and picked up the photograph one more time. She studied her father's face, younger and happier, not yet burdened by grief or obligation. She wondered if he'd ever imagined, in that moment frozen by the camera, that his life would become this, that his legacy would be measured not in memories but in millions. You did it, Dad, she said quietly to the image. You protected us. You built something amazing. I'm sorry I didn't understand sooner. I'm sorry I didn't see what you were doing. I'm sorry I thought you were broken when you were actually being brave. The photograph offered no response, but she felt better for saying it aloud. She returned it to its place on the desk and turned back to the filing cabinets. Tomorrow she'd begin the next phase, working through the authentication documents, understanding the legal process, preparing to file claims. Tonight, she wanted to sit here in her father's study, surrounded by his life's work, and simply appreciate the magnitude of what he'd accomplished. She opened the drawer marked Legacy and found something unexpected, a handwritten journal, newer than the other documents, dated from just 2 years ago. She opened it to the first entry. Sarah lost her job today. She didn't tell me, but I can hear it in her voice when we talk. She's trying to protect me, trying to pretend everything's fine. I want to tell her about the certificates. Want to explain that she'll never have to worry about money again, but I'm not ready. The authentication isn't complete. The documentation isn't perfect. If I tell her now and something goes wrong, If the claims fail or the courts rule against us, I'll have given her hope and then destroyed it. Better to wait. Better to be certain. Better to give her something complete than something promising. Sarah's throat tightened. She'd lost that job 18 months ago, before the divorce, before her father's diagnosis. She'd hidden it from him, just as he'd hidden his work from her. Two people protecting each other through silence, both carrying burdens the other didn't know existed. She flipped forward, reading entries where her father documented his research, his setbacks, his small victories in tracking down corporate successors and finding legal precedents. Between the technical details, personal notes appeared. Michelle called today, mentioned she's thinking about leaving her job. I wanted to tell her she doesn't have to worry, that she'll have more money than she could spend. But I stayed quiet. Soon. Maybe soon. Sarah's divorce is final. She sounds so tired. I hate that she's struggling while I sit here on a fortune I'm too afraid to claim. I'm getting old. I need to move faster. The girls need this now, not after I'm gone. But I need it to be right. I need the documentation perfect. I need them to trust what I've found, not to question whether their father was chasing a fantasy. The entries grew shorter as her father got sicker. The handwriting, always so careful, became shakier. The final entry was dated a week before his diagnosis. I went to Phillips today. They confirmed everything. The value is even higher than I thought. Some of the certificates have appreciated far beyond my calculations. The girls are going to be wealthy beyond comprehension. I'm finally ready to tell them. I've prepared a presentation, organized all the documents in sequence, made it so simple they can't possibly misunderstand. Tomorrow I'll call them both, arrange a meeting, explain everything. Tomorrow I'll finally share the secret I've been protecting for 40 years. Tomorrow. The entry ended there. Tomorrow had brought a diagnosis instead. Tomorrow had become 78 days of morphine and decline and death without the chance to explain. Tomorrow had betrayed him. Sarah closed the journal, tears running freely now. She pressed it against her chest and let herself cry for the father who'd worked so hard, loved so deeply, and run out of time just before the finish line. When the tears finally stopped, she sat in the dim study, surrounded by filing cabinets, and made a decision. She wouldn't throw any of this away. She'd preserve it, honor it, treat her father's filing system with the respect it deserved. Every drawer he'd labeled, every document he'd preserved, every cross-reference he'd created represented not just financial value, but love transformed into something tangible. This study wasn't a hoarder's nest. It was a temple of devotion, 43 years of protection made visible in metal cabinets and labeled drawers. Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time, it was Alicia. Hey, I'm outside your dad's house. You didn't answer my earlier text. Just checking that you're okay. Want company? She wiped her face, took a deep breath, and typed a response. I'm here. Come in. I have something to show you. 2 minutes later, Alicia appeared in the doorway of the study, her expression shifting from concern to confusion as she took in the filing cabinets. The documents scattered across the floor, and Sarah sitting amid it all with dried tears on her face and a leather-bound box in her lap. Sarah, what's going on? Are you okay? Sarah looked up at her oldest friend and managed a smile that felt both sad and triumphant. Remember how everyone said my dad was crazy? That he wasted his life hoarding paper? Alicia nodded slowly, clearly uncertain where this was going. They were wrong. Sarah lifted the appraisal from the box and held it out. All of them were wrong. Alicia took the document, started reading, and then stopped, her eyes going wide. Sarah, this number, this can't be real. It's real. My father authenticated every certificate. Phillips Securities confirmed everything. It's all legitimate. But this is almost $200 million. $197 million for 100,000, Sarah corrected softly. My great-grandfather built it. My grandfather protected it. And my father spent his entire adult life documenting it so Michelle and I would never have to doubt it was real. Alicia sank down onto the floor beside her, still staring at the appraisal. Your dad, he knew about this? He died trying to tell me. Sarah gestured at the filing cabinets. This whole system, Everything everyone said was crazy. It was all authentication. Every drawer I thought was hoarding was actually proof. Every document I thought was meaningless was actually essential. He organized our inheritance, and we were too blind to see it. They sat together in silence, the weight of the discovery pressing down on both of them. Finally, Alicia spoke, her voice quiet. "What are you going to do?" Sarah looked at the filing cabinets, then at the photograph of her family, then at the appraisal that valued her father's life's work at a number she still couldn't fully comprehend. "I'm going to finish what he started. I'm going to claim every certificate. I'm going to honor his work. And I'm going to make sure everyone who said he was crazy knows exactly how brilliant he was." The morning after her discovery, Sarah woke on the couch in her father's study, surrounded by documents she'd been reading until exhaustion finally overtook her around 3 in the morning. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating particles that danced in the air like tiny witnesses to the revolution happening within these walls. Her phone showed 17 missed calls. Michelle had called 6 times. David 3 times. The rest were numbers she didn't recognize. She sat up slowly, her neck stiff from sleeping at an awkward angle, and checked her voicemail. Michelle's voice came through, sharp with impatience. "Sarah, I don't know why you're not answering, but I've arranged for a junk removal company to come Thursday. That gives you 2 days to take anything you want to keep. They'll haul everything else away, including Dad's filing obsession. The realtor needs the house cleared by end of week. Call me back." Sarah deleted the message without responding. 2 days ago, she might have agreed. Now the thought of anyone touching her father's filing system made her physically ill. These weren't junk. These were the building blocks of a fortune, each drawer containing pieces of a puzzle her father had spent decades assembling. The next voicemail was from Phillips Securities Authentication, returned at 7:30 that morning. "Ms. Chen, this is Robert Phillips. I received your inquiry last night regarding your father's collection. I worked extensively with Thomas over the past several years. I'm deeply sorry for your loss. He was a brilliant researcher and one of the most dedicated clients I've ever worked with. I'd like to meet with you as soon as possible. This matter requires immediate attention. The authentication window for some securities closes within specific timeframes, and your father was very concerned about meeting those deadlines. Please call me today." Sarah's pulse quickened. Deadlines. Her father had been racing against time, not just his illness, but legal deadlines that could invalidate claims if not filed properly. She checked the time. 8:45. She called Phillips back immediately. He answered on the first ring. "Ms. Chun?" "Yes." "You said there are deadlines?" "Several." His voice was professional, but carried an undercurrent of urgency. Your father had documented everything meticulously, but he hadn't filed the actual claims yet. Some of the railroad bonds have notification requirements that expire within 60 days of the bondholder's death. Others have different timelines. We need to move quickly. How quickly? I'd like to meet today, if possible. I'm in San Francisco, but I can drive to Sacramento. This afternoon? Sarah looked around the study, at the filing cabinets standing like sentries, at the leather box still open on the floor with certificates worth millions visible inside. "Yes, this afternoon. 2 o'clock. I'll be there. Ms. Chun, I want you to know your father was extraordinary. What he accomplished with limited resources and no formal training in securities law is remarkable. The documentation he assembled would impress professional researchers. He was protecting something invaluable, and he did it brilliantly." After they hung up, Sarah stood and walked to the window. The neighborhood looked peaceful, ordinary, completely unaware that in this unremarkable house on this quiet street, a fortune had been hiding for 40 years. She thought about her father walking these same rooms, checking these same windows, carrying the weight of his secret like Atlas carrying the world. Her phone rang. Michelle again. This time Sarah answered. "Hi. Finally. Sarah, what's going on? Why aren't you responding?" "I've been busy going through Dad's things." Michelle's sigh carried across the line, heavy with exasperation. "That's what I'm calling about. Just stop. You're torturing yourself for no reason. Everything in that house is junk except maybe some furniture. The filing cabinets are worthless. The papers are worthless. Dad was sick, Sarah. Mentally sick. The hoarding was a symptom, not a hobby. I've already arranged. Cancel it, Sarah interrupted. What? Cancel the junk removal. I'm not throwing anything away. Silence stretched between them. When Michelle spoke again, her voice had shifted from impatient to concerned in a way that felt more condescending than caring. Sarah, I know you're grieving, but you can't let his delusion become your delusion. Holding on to all that paper isn't honoring Dad's memory. It's enabling the illness that controlled his life. You don't understand. Then explain it to me. Sarah looked at the appraisal on her father's desk, at the number that still felt impossible despite spending hours verifying every detail. Part of her wanted to tell Michelle right now, to prove everyone wrong, to vindicate their father immediately. But another part, the part that had spent the night reading his journal and understanding his work, wanted to protect the discovery a little longer. Wanted to honor his process by completing it properly before sharing. I can't explain over the phone, Sarah said finally. But I need you to trust me. Don't send anyone to remove anything. Give me 2 weeks. 2 weeks? Sarah, the realtor, I'll pay the realtor's fees if we need a delay. I'll cover any costs. Just give me 2 weeks. Michelle was quiet for a long moment. Are you okay? Really okay? Because this sounds like you're having some kind of breakdown, and I'm worried about you. I'm not having a breakdown. I found something important, but I need time to understand it completely before I can explain. Found something? In Dad's hoarding? In Dad's filing system, Sarah corrected. And yes, I found something that's going to change everything. Sarah, Michelle's voice carried that familiar tone, the one that said she was talking to a child who needed gentle correction. Dad spent 40 years collecting paper and convinced himself it was valuable. That doesn't make it actually valuable. I know you want his obsession to have meant something, but 2 weeks, Sarah interrupted again. That's all I'm asking. 2 weeks, and then I'll explain everything. If I'm wrong, I'll apologize and pay for the junk removal myself. But if I'm right, she paused, looking at the filing cabinets full of proof. If I'm right, you'll understand why I needed the time. After more protest and negotiation, Michelle finally agreed to a delay, though her skepticism radiated through every word. As soon as the call ended, Sarah texted Alicia, "Can you come back today? I need help, and I don't know who else to trust." Alicia arrived an hour later with coffee and bagels, practical offerings from someone who understood that crisis management required caffeine. She found Sarah in the study, surrounded by open binders and reference materials, trying to understand the legal framework her father had navigated. "Have you slept?" Alicia asked, handing her a coffee. "Some. On the couch." Sarah accepted the cup gratefully. "Robert Phillips is coming at 2. He's the securities expert Dad worked with. He says there are deadlines for filing some of the claims." Alicia settled onto the floor beside her, scanning the documents spread across every surface. "This is insane. Yesterday you were broke and grieving. Today you're sitting on almost $200 million. I won't actually have the money for months, maybe years." Phillips said the claim process is complex. Some companies will fight. Others will settle quickly. The timeline varies. Sarah pulled out one of her father's research binders. Dad documented everything. Every potential obstacle, every legal precedent, every corporate successor. It's like he built a roadmap for fighting battles he knew were coming. "Smart man. Brilliant man," Sarah corrected. "Everyone thought he was crazy, including me sometimes. But he was protecting us, building something that would keep us safe even after he was gone." Her voice cracked slightly. "He died before he could tell us. Ran out of time by weeks." Alicia squeezed her shoulder. "But you found it. That's what matters." "I almost didn't. If Michelle had sent the junk removal people yesterday instead of Thursday, they would have hauled away $200 million and we'd never have known." The thought made Sarah's stomach turn. We were that close to destroying everything Dad built. They spent the next hours organizing documents according to the system Sarah was beginning to understand. Her father had created a complex cross-referencing structure. Each certificate in the bottom drawer corresponded to multiple authentication binders, Each binder contained research that referenced other certificates, and everything tied back to legal precedents and corporate succession documents that proved the claims were valid. It was overwhelming and brilliant, the work of someone who taught himself securities law and corporate history through sheer determination, building expertise the way collectors build collections, one piece at a time until the whole structure stood complete. At 1:50, a silver BMW pulled up outside. Through the window, Sarah watched a man in his 60s emerge, carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive but well-used. He paused on the sidewalk, looking at the house with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. Respect, maybe, or sadness. She opened the door before he could knock. "Mr. Phillips?" "Robert, please." He extended his hand, his grip firm but not aggressive. His eyes were kind behind wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of eyes that had spent decades examining documents instead of people. "Thank you for seeing me so quickly. And again, I'm deeply sorry about Thomas. He was truly one of a kind." Sarah led him to the study. His reaction to the filing cabinets was immediate and unmistakable. Recognition and appreciation, like a musician seeing a familiar instrument. "He's organized by corporate succession," Robert said, running his hand along the cabinet labels. "Authentication, provenance, legal framework. Everything you need to file bulletproof claims." He turned to Sarah. "You said you found the bottom drawer?" "Last night, with the certificates and the 2019 appraisal you prepared." "May I see them?" Sarah retrieved the leather box and set it carefully on her father's desk. Robert opened it with reverent care, his fingers tracing the edges of documents he'd clearly examined before. "When Thomas first contacted me 7 years ago, I thought he was another amateur with a shoebox of worthless stock certificates. People inherit them all the time and don't realize they're just historical curiosities." He lifted out one of the AT&T certificates, holding it up to the light. "But within 5 minutes of examining his documentation, I knew this was different. Thomas hadn't just inherited these certificates. He'd traced their entire lineage from issuance through every corporate transformation. He understood the legal obligations better than lawyers I'd worked with. And the certificates themselves." Robert's voice filled with something like awe. "Ms. Chen, your great-grandfather had impeccable timing. He bought during the Depression when institutions were liquidating at pennies on the dollar. These aren't random securities. These are foundational pieces of American infrastructure." "The appraisal says they're worth $197 million, Sarah said, still needing to hear someone else confirm the number wasn't a mistake. "As of 6 months ago, yes. Current market conditions might adjust that slightly, but we're still looking at generational wealth." Robert set down the certificate carefully. "The question now is execution. Your father did 95% of the work. We need to complete the final 5%, which is filing the claims, negotiating with corporate successor entities, and navigating the legal challenges that will inevitably arise." "What kind of challenges?" "Companies hate these claims. They represent obligations they've hidden on their books for decades, hoping bondholders would forget or die without heirs who knew what they had. When someone like Thomas appears with proper documentation, they'll fight first and settle later. That's why the documentation is so critical. Your father knew they'd challenge everything, so he built a case that's essentially airtight." Robert opened his briefcase and pulled out a timeline. "Here's what we're facing. 7 railroad bonds require notification within 60 days of the bondholder's death. We're at day 23, which gives us 37 days to file. 3 utility company securities have different timelines, but similar urgency. The stock certificates are more flexible, but delays can create complications." He spread the timeline across the desk. "I recommend we file claims in waves. First wave immediately, the time-sensitive bonds. Second wave within 30 days, the utility securities. Third wave within 90 days, everything else. Each wave will require different legal approaches, different negotiations, different precedents." "How much will this cost?" Sarah asked, thinking about her nearly empty bank account. "Legal fees for this type of case typically run between 5 and 10% of recovered value. I work with a law firm in San Francisco that specializes in historical securities. They'll handle negotiations, corporate successor identification, and litigation if necessary. They work on contingency, meaning they're paid from the settlement, not up front. 5% of $197 million was nearly $10 million in legal fees alone. The number was staggering, but Sarah realized it meant she wouldn't need money. She didn't have to claim money she was owed. What I need to do? First, sign engagement letters with the law firm. I'll arrange a video call for tomorrow so you can meet the attorneys. Second, we need to secure the certificates. They should be in a bank vault, not here. Third, we start filing. I'll prepare the first wave of notifications today if you authorize me to proceed. Sarah looked at Alicia, who'd been watching the conversation with wide eyes. Her friend nodded slightly. Sarah turned back to Robert. What will my father want me to do? Robert smiled, sad but genuine. Thomas spent 7 years preparing for this exact moment. He documented everything, anticipated every obstacle, and built a structure designed to win. He was ready to file himself before the diagnosis. He'd want you to finish what he started. He paused, his expression growing more serious. But he'd also want you to be careful. These companies have deep pockets and powerful legal teams. They'll investigate you, looking for anything that might undermine your credibility or create grounds to challenge the claims. Your father was meticulous partly because he knew they'd scrutinize everything. So, I need to be perfect. You need to follow the roadmap he created. Trust his research. Don't deviate from his documentation. And most importantly, don't let anyone convince you these claims aren't valid. They are. Thomas proved it beyond any doubt. Sarah thought about Michelle's skepticism, Karen's pity, David's impatience, all the people who'd looked at her father's filing system and seen madness instead of method. People are going to think I'm chasing a fantasy. Let them think that. Your father endured decades of people questioning his work. He never stopped because he knew the truth. You know it now, too. Sarah looked around the study, at the filing cabinets that had preserved her family's fortune, at the desk where her father had spent countless hours researching and documenting and protecting. She thought about his final words, confused but desperate. Check the bottom drawer. He died trying to guide her here, to this moment, to this decision. Okay, she said finally. Let's do it. Let's file the claims. Robert's expression brightened. I'll make some calls. We'll need to move quickly on the time-sensitive items. Can you bring the certificates to my office tomorrow? I have a vault there, and we'll need to photograph everything for the legal team. After Robert left, Sarah and Alicia sat in the study, the weight of what had just been set in motion settling over them. You're really doing this, Alicia said, something like wonder in her voice. I have to. Dad did all the hard work. I just need to follow through. Your life is about to change completely. You know that, right? Sarah looked at her phone, at the messages from David demanding mediation payments, at Michelle's texts full of skepticism and concern. My life needs to change. I'm 34, divorced, unemployed, living month to month. Dad left me a way out. More than that. He left me proof that patience and faith and careful work can build something extraordinary. She picked up her father's journal from the desk. He wrote that he was afraid to tell us because he wasn't sure the claims would hold up in court. He wanted everything perfect before giving us hope. Was he right to wait? I don't know. Maybe if he'd told us earlier, we could have helped him file while he was still alive. Or maybe we would have rushed things and made mistakes that undermine the claims. Sarah set down the journal. What I do know is that he loved us enough to spend his entire adult life protecting something he'd never see us enjoy. That's not madness. That's devotion. Her phone rang. Michelle, Sarah answered, already bracing for more skepticism. Hi, Sarah. I've been thinking about what you said this morning. Michelle's voice was softer now, less defensive. About finding something. I don't understand what you mean, but you've never asked me for time before. You've never pushed back. So I'm trying to trust that you know what you're doing. The concession surprised Sarah. Michelle rarely backed down once she'd committed to a position. Thank you, but I need you to promise me something. If this turns out to be nothing, if Dad's papers really are just hoarding, you'll let it go. You'll let me help you clear the house and move on. You won't let his illness become yours. Sarah felt a flash of anger at the word illness, but she pushed it down. Michelle didn't know yet. She would soon, but right now she was operating on the same assumptions everyone else held about Thomas Chen and his filing obsession. I promise. 2 weeks, and then we'll know for sure. After the call ended, Sarah stood and walked to the locked cabinets she hadn't yet fully explored. The drawer marked Legacy contained her father's journal and the appraisal. But she suspected there were more documents below, more layers of his work waiting to be discovered. She unlocked the second drawer and found it filled with correspondence between her father and various securities experts, corporate historians, and legal researchers. The letters dated back 15 years, revealing a network of specialists her father had consulted, always carefully, always protecting the full scope of what he possessed. One letter from a Harvard Business School professor caught her attention. Mr. Chen, I've reviewed your documentation regarding the 1947 Consolidated Edison certificates. Your analysis of the corporate succession is flawless. The merger trail you've traced through 7 separate corporate entities is the kind of research I'd expect from a doctoral candidate, not an amateur researcher. Have you considered publishing your findings? This would be valuable to securities historians studying Depression-era investment patterns. Her father's response was polite but firm. Thank you for your kind words, but I prefer to keep my research private. My interest is in preserving these documents for my family, not in academic recognition. Sarah smiled, imagining her father declining publication offers to protect his secret. He'd been brilliant enough to contribute to academic understanding, but focused enough to prioritize his family over professional recognition. The discipline that required was extraordinary. She continued through the drawer, finding more evidence of her father's expertise. He'd been consulted by other researchers, had his work cited in obscure journals, always anonymously at his request, and had built a reputation in certain specialized circles as someone who understood historical securities better than almost anyone. The bottom section of the legacy drawer contained something unexpected, a series of letters her father had written but never sent, addressed to Sarah and Michelle. The dates ranged over 15 years, marking different moments in their lives. Sarah opened the first one, dated from her college graduation. My dear Sarah, today you graduated summa cum laude, and I couldn't be prouder. I watched you walk across that stage and thought about your great-grandfather Chen Wei, who couldn't read or write English when he arrived in America. He would have wept to see his great-granddaughter earning academic honors. You asked me last night why I work so hard on my filing system, why I spend so much time organizing documents that seem meaningless. I wanted to tell you then, wanted to explain that every hour I spend is an hour invested in your future. But I'm not ready. The authentication isn't complete. Soon I'll show you what Chen Wei built, what your grandfather protected, what I've been preserving. Until then, know that everything I do is for you and Michelle. Everything. I love you. Dad. Sarah's vision blurred. She set the letter down carefully and reached for another, dated from her wedding day. Michelle and Sarah. Today, Sarah married David, and I stood there smiling while my heart broke. Not because I don't like David. He seems fine, but because I see the way Sarah looks at him when he talks about money, about security, about building a future. She's worried. She's scared she won't be able to contribute equally, won't be able to maintain the lifestyle he's accustomed to. I could solve that fear with a single conversation. I could tell her that she's going to inherit more money than David will earn in his entire career. But I can't. Not yet. The railroad bonds still need authentication. The utility securities require more legal research. If I tell her now and something goes wrong, I'll have promised her security and delivered disappointment. Better to wait. Better to be certain. God, I hate waiting. More letters followed, marking Michelle's job promotion, Sarah's miscarriage, Michelle's move to Singapore, Sarah's divorce. Each one revealed a father who'd wanted desperately to share his secret, to ease his daughter's worries, to prove that their futures were secure. And each one showed him holding back, waiting for perfection, running out of time while trying to make sure everything was exactly right. The final unsent letter was dated 3 months before his diagnosis. My darling daughters, I'm 72 years old, and I've been working on this project for 43 years. Phillips confirmed today that the authentication is complete. Every certificate is verified. Every corporate succession is documented. Every legal precedent is researched and filed. I'm ready to tell you. I'm finally ready to share what your great-grandfather built and what I protected. Tomorrow I'll call you both. Tomorrow I'll arrange a meeting. Tomorrow I'll show you the filing system isn't madness. It's love made visible. Tomorrow I'll prove that everything I've done had purpose. Tomorrow you'll understand. I'm so ready for tomorrow. But tomorrow had never come. Tomorrow had brought cancer instead of revelation, death instead of explanation. Her father had died with his secrets still locked in drawers, still hidden behind labels only he understood, still waiting for the perfect moment that never arrived. Sarah wiped her eyes and stood, suddenly furious with her father for waiting so long, for holding back when they needed help, for choosing perfection over proximity. Then the fury dissolved into understanding. He hadn't been protecting the money. He'd been protecting them from hope that might be false, from promises that might not hold, from inheriting his burden before he was certain it was a gift. Alicia appeared in the doorway, her face showing she'd been crying too. I read some of the letters. He loved us so much, Sarah said, voice breaking. So much that he tortured himself trying to make everything perfect for us. He did make it perfect, just not in time to see it. Sarah looked at the filing cabinets, seeing them now as monuments not to obsession, but to devotion. 43 years of careful work, of patient research, of love expressed through organization and documentation and protection. Her father had built them a fortress disguised as filing cabinets, a fortune disguised as hoarding, a legacy disguised as madness. I need to tell Michelle, Sarah said suddenly. Not in 2 weeks. Now. She deserves to know what Dad did for us. She deserves to understand he wasn't sick. She pulled out her phone and called. Michelle answered immediately, her voice cautious. Sarah, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. Michelle, I need you to listen very carefully. Don't interrupt. Just listen. She took a deep breath and told her sister everything. The bottom drawer, the certificates, the appraisal, Robert Phillips, the legal deadlines, the unsent letters. She described their great-grandfather buying securities during the Depression, their grandfather protecting them through wars and recessions, their father spending his entire adult life documenting and authenticating every piece. When she finished, silence stretched across the line. Sarah counted seconds. 10, 20, 30. Finally, Michelle spoke, her voice strange and distant. You're telling me Dad was sitting on $200 million. $197,400,000. Yes. While we struggled, while you lost your job and went through divorce, while I worked 80-hour weeks in Singapore, while both of us worried about money constantly. He was waiting for the right time, waiting to be sure. The right time never came. No, it didn't. More silence. Then Michelle's voice came back different, smaller, younger somehow. Is it real, Sarah? Are you absolutely certain this isn't just another delusion? Because I can't. I can't process this if it's not real. It's real. Robert Phillips authenticated everything. The lawyers are preparing to file claims. It's happening. Michelle made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Dad was a genius. Yes, he was. Everyone said he was crazy. I said he was crazy. We were all wrong. Sarah, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I wanted to throw it all away. I almost destroyed everything he built. You didn't know. Nobody knew except Dad. They talked for another hour. Michelle asking questions Sarah was still learning to answer, both of them processing the revelation together across continents and time zones. When they finally hung up, Sarah felt lighter somehow, as though sharing the secret had distributed its weight across more shoulders. She returned to the study and looked at the filing cabinets with new eyes. Tomorrow she'd transport the certificates to Robert's vault. Tomorrow the lawyers would begin filing claims. Tomorrow her life would start moving toward a future her father had built in secret. But tonight, she wanted to stay here in this room, surrounded by his work, feeling close to him in a way she hadn't while he was alive. She pulled out more of his research, reading his notes, following his logic, appreciating the brilliant mind that had been hidden behind filing cabinet labels and cross-reference systems. Alicia had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from the emotional weight of the day. Sarah covered her with a blanket and settled into her father's chair, a binder of railroad bond research open in her lap. The house was quiet around her, peaceful in the way old houses get when they've witnessed important things. Somewhere in this silence, Sarah felt her father's presence not as a ghost or spirit, but as the accumulated evidence of his life's work. Every drawer he'd labeled, every document he'd preserved, every cross-reference he'd created was him speaking across time, saying "I love you" in the only language he knew how to speak after grief took his words. She opened the binder and began reading, following her father's research, learning what he'd learned, understanding what he'd understood. By morning, she'd be ready to finish what he'd started. But tonight, she just wanted to sit here with his work, feeling proud of him in a way she hadn't known how to feel while he was alive. "Understand now, Dad," she whispered to the filing cabinets. "I see what you were doing. I know what you built, and I promise I'll finish it. I'll make sure everyone knows you were brilliant, not broken. I'll make sure the world sees what I finally see." The cabinets stood silent, but Sarah felt certain her father heard. The next morning arrived with crystalline clarity, the kind of California sunshine that made everything feel possible. Sarah woke in her father's chair, neck stiff, research binder still open in her lap. Alicia was already awake, standing at the window with coffee in hand, watching the neighborhood come to life. "I called in sick to work," Alicia said without turning around. "You're going to need help transporting those certificates to San Francisco. And honestly, I can't miss this. This is history." Sarah stood, joints protesting, and joined her friend at the window. The street looked exactly as it had yesterday, as it had for decades. But everything had changed. The modest house where Thomas Chen had lived and died was no longer just another property in a middle-class neighborhood. It was the birthplace of a fortune, the vault that had protected generational wealth through 40 years of patience. "Karen's outside," Alicia said, nodding toward the yellow house 3 doors down. Sarah saw her father's neighbor standing on her porch, coffee mug in hand, staring at Thomas Chen's house with an expression that seemed contemplative. Had she heard something? Did rumors travel that fast in neighborhoods where people had lived beside each other for decades? Sarah's phone buzzed. "Robert Phillips. I've arranged the vault transfer for 10 a.m. Bring the certificates in a leather box. Don't make copies. Don't photograph them yourself. Don't let them out of your sight. The law firm has a courier service meeting us there with proper security. Also, the attorneys want to meet you via video call at 2 p.m. today. They're expediting everything due to the deadlines." She showed the message to Alicia. "This is really happening. Did you think it wasn't? Part of me keeps waiting to wake up and find out the appraisal was wrong, that Dad made a mistake, that I misread the numbers." Sarah looked at the filing cabinets. How does someone sit on $200 million for 40 years without telling anyone? Your dad wasn't sitting on it. He was building it. There's a difference. Alicia set down her coffee. "Come on. We should get the certificates secured before anything can go wrong." They worked together, carefully transferring the documents from the bottom drawer into the leather box. Each certificate felt impossibly fragile, paper that represented millions but could be destroyed by fire or water or careless handling. Sarah understood now why her father had been so obsessive about preservation, why he'd spent decades creating redundant documentation systems, why he'd treated every piece of paper like a sacred text. Because for him, they were. At 9:30, Karen appeared at the door. Sarah saw her through the window, hesitating on the porch, clearly working up courage to knock. When she finally did, the sound echoed through the quiet house like a judgment. Sarah opened the door. Karen's expression was complicated, curiosity mixed with concern, maybe a touch of embarrassment. "Sarah, honey, I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to check on you. I saw lights on all night. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Karen. Just sorting through Dad's things like I said." "It's just..." Karen glanced past Sarah into the hallway, as if trying to see what was happening inside. "I've been thinking about what I said the other day, about your father's mental state. I want you to know I didn't mean any disrespect. I care about Thomas. We all did. I know. But Sarah, honey, I'm worried about you. Spending all night in that study, not answering calls, isolating yourself with his papers. I've seen people get lost in grief, convince themselves that meaningless things have meaning because they can't let go. Karen's voice softened with practiced sympathy. Have you considered talking to someone? A therapist, maybe? Someone who could help you process this in a healthy way? Sarah felt Alicia tense behind her, protective instincts activating. She put a hand on her friend's arm, signaling calm. Karen, I appreciate your concern. Really, but I'm not having a breakdown. I found something in Dad's filing system. Something important. Sweetie, I'm sure it feels important, but documents worth $197 million. The words landed like a physical blow. Karen's expression cycled through disbelief, confusion, and calculation so quickly Sarah could track each emotion as it appeared and dissolved. I'm sorry, what? My great-grandfather accumulated securities during the Depression. My father spent 43 years authenticating them. They're real, Karen. They're worth almost $200 million. Sarah kept her voice calm, factual, letting the information speak for itself. I'm meeting with lawyers today to begin filing claims. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She looked past Sarah again, as if the filing cabinets might somehow confirm or deny what she'd just heard. But Thomas, he was an insurance adjuster. He lived so modestly. If he had that kind of money, he didn't have the money. He had certificates that could become money, but only with proper authentication and legal claims. That's what the filing system was for. Not hoarding. Documentation. I don't understand. Nobody did. That was the problem. Sarah stepped back from the door, making it clear the conversation was ending. I need to go, Karen. I have meetings in San Francisco. But you should know, my father wasn't crazy. He was brilliant. And everyone who said otherwise, who felt sorry for him, who pitted his obsession, was wrong. She closed the door gently but firmly, leaving Karen standing on the porch with her worldview visibly shattering. Through the window, Sarah watched her neighbor walk back to her house slowly, phone already emerging from her pocket. By this afternoon, the entire neighborhood would know. By tomorrow, the story would spread through Sacramento like wildfire. That felt good, Alicia said. Probably shouldn't have felt that good, but it did. Sarah smiled despite herself. Dad endured 40 years of people thinking he was crazy. At least I only have to endure it for a few more hours before the proof becomes public. They loaded the leather box into Alicia's car. Sarah's aging Honda felt too unreliable for transporting nearly $200 million and drove to San Francisco through morning traffic that seemed bizarrely mundane considering what they were carrying. Alicia kept glancing at the box in the back seat as if expecting it to disappear. Does it feel real yet? She asked as they crossed the Bay Bridge. No. Yes. I don't know. Sarah watched the San Francisco skyline emerge through the fog. Yesterday, I was worried about making rent. Today, I'm transporting certificates worth more than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. How is that supposed to feel real? Your dad lived with that dissonance for 40 years. He lived with worse. He knew his daughters were struggling, and he couldn't tell them help was coming. He watched us worry about money while sitting on a fortune he was too responsible to claim prematurely. Sarah's throat tightened. That must have been torture. Robert Phillips's office was in the financial district, a modest suite on the 14th floor of a building that had probably been elegant in the 1970s and was now just tired. The waiting room held faded leather chairs and framed certificates on the walls. Authenticated securities from various eras, displayed like hunting trophies or religious icons. Robert emerged from his office before they could sit. Ms. Chun, thank you for coming. He shook hands with both of them, then gestured toward his office. The security team is already here. Let's get the certificates properly vaulted before we do anything else. Two men in suits that screamed professional security stood near Robert's desk, flanking a reinforced metal case designed for transporting valuables. Robert introduced them. Marcus and Jean from Sterling Security Services, specialists in high-value document transportation. Sarah opened the leather box, and Robert began the process of cataloging each certificate. He handled them with white cotton gloves, photographing front and back with a high-resolution camera, noting any damage or deterioration, recording serial numbers and issue dates. The security team watched silently, their presence making the entire procedure feel simultaneously more real and more surreal. "These are in remarkable condition," Robert said as he worked. "Your father stored them properly. Acid-free sleeves, climate-controlled environment, minimal handling. Some collectors spend millions acquiring certificates in worse condition than these." "Collectors?" Sarah asked. "Historical securities have value beyond their redemption claims. Even if a bond can't be redeemed, it might be worth thousands as a collectible. But these—" He held up one of the railroad bonds, light filtering through the elaborate printed border. "These have both collectible value and redemption value. That's exceptionally rare." The cataloging took 90 minutes. Each certificate was photographed, measured, assessed for authenticity markers, watermarks, serial numbers, signature verification. Robert worked with the precision of someone who'd spent decades examining historical documents, his fingers moving confidently across paper that represented fortunes. When he finished, Marcus and Jean carefully transferred everything to the reinforced case. They sealed it with a combination lock, then had both Robert and Sarah sign a chain of custody document. The whole procedure felt like something from a heist movie, elaborate security for paper that looked ancient and fragile, but represented wealth that could change lives. "The vault is 3 blocks away," Robert explained. "Sterling will transport the case. We'll follow separately. Standard protocol. Never transport client and assets together." Sarah watched the security team leave with the case holding her family's fortune. For a moment, panic spiked through her. What if something happened? What if they disappeared? What if this was an elaborate scam and she'd just handed away $200 million to strangers? Robert must have seen her expression. "Sterling has ensured transport worth over $3 billion in the past 5 years without a single loss. Your certificates are safer with them than they would be anywhere else." They followed in Robert's car, Sarah and Alicia in the back seat, watching the security team's vehicle navigate traffic ahead of them. The vault turned out to be in a nondescript building that offered no indication it held hundreds of millions in assets. Robert explained that high-end vaults deliberately maintained boring exteriors. Wealth attraction attracted attention, and attention attracted risk. Inside, the transformation was dramatic. Military-grade security, biometric scanners, guards who looked like they'd served in special forces. Robert signed them in, provided authentication that seemed to involve retinal scanning and fingerprint verification, and led them through a series of locked doors into a climate-controlled repository where metal drawers lined every wall from floor to ceiling. He retrieved a specific drawer, B47, and opened it to reveal a space roughly the size of a large filing cabinet drawer. The security team transferred the certificates carefully, providing Sarah with documentation showing exactly what had been stored, when, and under what conditions. "You're the only person besides me who can access this drawer," Robert explained. "The law firm will need to retrieve specific certificates as we file claims, but they'll require your written authorization for each access. Nothing leaves this vault without your explicit permission." Sarah signed more documents, her hand starting to cramp from the morning's paperwork. When they finally finished, Robert led them back to his office where lunch had been delivered, sandwiches and coffee, working lunch food that seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what they were discussing. "The video call with the attorneys is in 30 minutes, Robert said, checking his watch. "I want to prepare you for what they'll say. Morrison & Burke is the best firm in the country for historical securities litigation. They've recovered over $4 billion in the past decade. But they're aggressive, sometimes ruthlessly so. They'll push for immediate filing on everything, maximum pressure on every corporate successor. Some clients find their approach intense." "Intense how?" Alicia asked. "They treat each case like warfare. Their philosophy is that corporations have been hiding these debts for decades, sometimes over a century. They view recovery not just as legal action, but as moral imperative. That intensity wins cases, but it can be overwhelming for clients who aren't prepared for litigation that might drag on for years. Sarah thought about her father's journal, about his careful research and patient documentation. My father prepared for this his entire adult life. I think I can handle intense lawyers. Robert smiled. Thomas said something similar when I first introduced him to Morrison and Burke. He liked their approach. Said companies that buried obligations deserved aggressive opposition. At precisely 2 o'clock, Robert's computer screen flickered to life with a video call. 3 faces appeared, 2 men and a woman, all in their 40s or 50s, all wearing expressions of focused intelligence that suggested they'd built careers on being smarter and more ruthless than their opponents. The woman spoke first. Ms. Chen, I'm Catherine Morrison, senior partner. This is James Burke and David Chen. No relation, I assume? She smiled briefly at what was clearly a lawyer joke she'd made many times. No relation, Sarah confirmed. We've reviewed the documentation your father assembled. It's extraordinary work. Most clients come to us with shoeboxes of certificates and vague family stories. Your father provided complete corporate succession tracking, authentication documentation, and legal framework that would make our research department jealous. This significantly accelerates our timeline. James Burke leaned forward. Here's our strategy. We file the first wave of claims tomorrow. 7 railroad bonds with 60-day notification requirements. We're demanding immediate acknowledgement from successor companies. Union Pacific, Berkshire Hathaway subsidiaries, and 3 smaller rail operations that inherited obligations. We expect resistance on all fronts. What kind of resistance? Sarah asked. They'll claim the bonds were redeemed decades ago, without proper documentation. They'll challenge your chain of title, suggesting the certificates passed out of legitimate ownership at some point. They'll dispute valuations, argue that corporate successions severed obligations, claim that statutes of limitation have expired. Standard playbook for hidden debt litigation. David Chen picked up the explanation. That's why your father's documentation is crucial. He anticipated every argument and assembled countervailing evidence. Chain of title? He has provenance documentation going back to original purchase. Redemption claims? He has correspondence from the companies themselves admitting the bonds remain outstanding. Corporate succession? He tracked every merger, every acquisition, every reorganization. They're going to have a very difficult time defending positions that your father already disproved. Catherine Morrison's expression suggested satisfaction. We've handled hundreds of these cases. This is the most meticulously documented claim we've ever seen. Your father essentially did our job for us, which means we can move faster and more aggressively than usual. Our fee structure is standard, 5% of recovered value, paid from settlements, not upfront. No recovery, no fee. We believe in our cases, and we believe in this one particularly. 5% of $197 million was nearly $10 million. Sarah tried not to flinch at the number. What's the timeline for actual recovery? Varies dramatically, James Burke said. Some companies will settle quickly to avoid publicity. Historical debt obligations are embarrassing. They suggest corporate negligence, poor record-keeping, deliberate debt burial. Other companies will fight every step, forcing us into litigation that could take 2 to 3 years. Based on your father's portfolio, we estimate 30% will settle within 6 months, another 40% within 18 months, and the remainder will require extended litigation. So I won't see any money for months? You'll start seeing settlements within 3 to 4 months, Catherine said. We prioritize the smaller claims first. Easier to win, faster settlement, provides working capital for larger litigation. Your father had several utility company securities worth 10 to 15 million each. Those should settle quickly. The larger railroad bonds and AT&T certificates will take longer but represent the bulk of the value. Robert spoke up. The firm can arrange a credit line against the expected settlements if Ms. Chen needs immediate liquidity. Standard practice in cases like this. Sarah thought about her overdrawn checking account, her maxed-out credit cards, David's demands for mediation payments. How much credit? We could arrange $5 million immediately, Catherine said. enough to resolve personal financial issues while we work through the claims. Interest rate is prime plus 2, paid from settlement proceeds. It's not charity. You're borrowing against assets you demonstrably own. We just need to navigate the recovery process. $5 million. 6 months ago, Sarah had worried about making her $400 rent payment. Now lawyers were offering her $5 million as a casual advance against a fortune she hadn't fully processed owning. "I'll need to think about that," she said, her voice sounding distant even to herself. The video call continued for another hour, covering filing strategies, potential legal obstacles, media handling. Morrison and Burke recommended complete silence until settlements began, and logistics for the next several months. When it finally ended, Sarah sat back in Robert's office chair, exhausted from information overload. "That was a lot," Alicia said, understating dramatically. "Your father managed all of this alone," Robert said. "Researching, documenting, preparing. No legal team, no support staff, just him and his filing system. What Morrison and Burke just outlined would cost most people hundreds of thousands in consulting fees just to understand. Thomas did it himself, over decades, while working full-time and raising 2 daughters." Sarah looked at Robert. "Did you tell him? Before he died? Did he know the claims would work?" "We spoke 2 weeks before his diagnosis." Robert's expression grew sad. He was finally ready. He'd completed every authentication, assembled every document, prepared every argument. He said he was going to tell you and Michelle the following weekend. He was excited, Sarah, genuinely joyful in a way I'd never seen him before. He said, "Finally, I can give my daughters what they deserve." Robert paused, emotion cracking his professional demeanor. Then the diagnosis came, and everything accelerated too fast. He tried to explain in the hospital, but the morphine made him confused. He kept saying bottom drawer and check the cabinets, but nobody understood what he meant. "I understand now," Sarah said quietly. "I found what he was trying to tell me." They drove back to Sacramento in afternoon traffic, both of them silent, processing the day's revelations. Sarah watched the landscape roll past, thinking about her father making this drive, meeting with Robert, preparing documentation, building the case that would transform his daughters' lives after he was gone. When they finally reached her father's house, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that made the modest neighborhood look almost beautiful. Sarah saw immediately that something had changed. Cars lined the street that were never there before. People stood on porches, watching her father's house with obvious curiosity. Karen's earlier phone call had clearly activated the neighborhood gossip network, and now everyone wanted to see whether Thomas Chen's daughter was actually claiming some impossible fortune or just having a very public breakdown. "Want me to stay?" Alicia asked, eyeing the gathered neighbors. "No, I can handle this." Sarah squeezed her friend's hand. "Thank you for today, for believing me, for helping. That's what family does. Blood or chosen doesn't matter." After Alicia left, Sarah walked to her father's front door, aware of eyes tracking her movement. She unlocked it and stepped inside, closing the door on the watching neighbors and their questions and their judgment. Tomorrow, Morrison and Burke would file the first claims. Tomorrow, the legal process would officially begin. Tomorrow, the world would start learning that Thomas Chen hadn't been crazy after all. But tonight, she wanted to be here in his house, surrounded by the filing system that everyone had mocked, feeling close to the father she'd failed to understand while he was alive. She made tea in his kitchen, using his chipped mug, and carried it to the study. The filing cabinets stood exactly as they had yesterday, as they had for 40 years, silent witnesses to devotion disguised as obsession. She ran her hand along the metal surfaces, feeling the coolness against her palm, and thought about her father standing in this exact spot, touching these exact cabinets, protecting what was inside them through sheer determination. Her phone buzzed. "Michelle, I told my boss I'm taking 2 weeks leave. I'm flying to Sacramento tomorrow. I need to see this. I need to see what Dad built. And Sarah, I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I'm sorry I thought he was sick. I'm sorry for everything." Sarah typed back. "He would forgive you. He'd forgive all of us for not understanding. Come home. There's so much to show you. She opened the drawer marked Provenance and began pulling out documents she hadn't yet examined. These were older than the others, some dating back to her grandfather's era, showing how Chen Wei's original purchases had been tracked and preserved through generations. There were letters between her grandfather and his son, brief notes in Chinese that Sarah wished she could read, passing the responsibility of protection from one generation to the next. One document, protected in an archival sleeve, caught her attention. A photograph from 1932 showing a young Chinese man standing in front of a building marked San Francisco Stock Exchange. He wore a simple suit that looked borrowed, his expression serious, his hand resting on a leather briefcase. On the back, someone had written in English, Chen Wei, age 53, making first investment during the Great Depression. Everyone said he was foolish. He said he was patient. Sarah stared at her great-grandfather's face, seeing determination in his eyes that reminded her of her father. Two men separated by a generation, but connected by vision, by patience, by the willingness to be called foolish while building something extraordinary. She set up the photograph on her father's desk, next to the family beach photo, creating a shrine to the Chen family architects who'd built a fortune from faith and patience and careful documentation. 3 generations of work, culminating in this moment, in this study, in a breakthrough that had come too late for the builder to witness, but exactly on time for his purpose. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered cautiously. Ms. Chen, this is Victoria Park from the Sacramento Bee. I'm a reporter covering local interest stories. I heard something remarkable about your family, and I was hoping we could talk. Sarah's pulse quickened. Karen's phone call had spread beyond the neighborhood. I'm not doing interviews. I understand, but Ms. Chun, if the story I heard is true, this is significant. A local family sitting on a Depression-era fortune for generations? That's not just a curiosity. That's American history. Your great-grandfather's story deserves to be told. My lawyers advised against media contact until the legal claims are filed. I can wait. But Ms. Chun, stories like this break with or without your cooperation. Better to have accurate information from the source than to let speculation and rumor define your family's narrative. Victoria's voice was professional but persuasive. I knew your father slightly. I interviewed him once for a piece about longtime Sacramento residents. He was thoughtful, careful with his words, clearly protecting something. I'd like to honor his story properly. Sarah thought about Morrison and Burke's advice about media silence. But she also thought about her father enduring 40 years of people thinking he was crazy, dying before anyone understood what he'd been doing. Maybe telling the story accurately, with proper context and respect, was better than letting neighbors and strangers define it through gossip and misunderstanding. If I agree to talk, and I'm not promising anything, it will have to be after the legal claims are filed. Probably next week. I can absolutely work with that timeline. Thank you, Ms. Chun. And for what it's worth, your father was clearly an extraordinary man. I'm glad his story will finally be understood. After the call, Sarah sat at her father's desk and opened his daily planner again, reading through entries from his final months. So many notes about filing deadlines, about documentation that needed completion, about his growing urgency to finish before time ran out. He'd known, somewhere in his body, if not his conscious mind, that he was racing toward an ending. One entry from 6 months before his diagnosis read, "Dreamed last night that I was explaining the filing system to Sarah and Michelle, but every time I opened a drawer, it was empty. Woke up terrified. Need to add redundant documentation systems. Need backups for the backups. Cannot let 40 years of work disappear because I failed to document properly." Her father had died afraid his work would be lost, convinced his daughters might not find it or might not understand it if they did. Sarah felt a fierce determination to prove him wrong, to validate every hour he'd spent, every document he'd preserved, every decision he'd made to protect rather than spend. She pulled out her laptop and began drafting an email to Morrison and Burke, outlining additional documentation she'd found, suggesting research angles her father had noted but not fully explored, demonstrating that she wasn't just a passive heir waiting for settlements, but an active participant in completing his work. Catherine Morrison responded within minutes. Ms. Chen, this additional documentation is valuable. Your father trained you well, even if he didn't realize it. You have his attention to detail, his thoroughness. That's going to serve you well in the months ahead. The companies we're targeting will try to intimidate you, to make you doubt your claim's validity. Don't let them. Your father's research is bulletproof, and so are you. Sarah smiled at the screen. Her father had trained her in ways she hadn't recognized. Years of watching him work in his study, seeing his dedication to organization, observing his refusal to be deterred by skepticism, all of it had shaped her more than she'd known. She was Thomas Chen's daughter, and that meant something now. It meant she could finish what he'd started. It meant she could honor his legacy not just by claiming the fortune, but by demonstrating the same patience, thoroughness, and determination that had defined his life. She worked through the evening, organizing documents for Morrison and Burke's legal team, cross-referencing her father's research with modern corporate structures, identifying potential arguments against their claims, and assembling countervailing evidence. The work was painstaking, detail-oriented, exactly the kind of task most people would find tedious. But Sarah found it meditative, almost worshipful, a way of connecting with her father through the language he'd spoken fluently. Documentation. Around midnight, exhausted but satisfied, she finally closed the filing cabinet she'd been exploring and sat back in her father's chair. The study looked different now, transformed by understanding from a hoarder's nest into a research library, from evidence of mental illness into proof of genius. She picked up her phone and composed a message to Michelle. Dad left us more than money. He left us a blueprint for patience, for faith, for building something extraordinary one small step at a time. He taught us that what looks like madness from outside might be wisdom from inside. He showed us that love isn't always expressed in words. Sometimes it's expressed in filing cabinets and labeled drawers and 4 decades of careful work. I'm grateful for the money, but I'm more grateful for understanding who he really was. See you tomorrow. Michelle's response came immediately, despite the time difference in Singapore, flying out in 6 hours. Can't sleep. Keep thinking about all the times I dismissed him, all the times I thought he was wasting his life. I want to see the filing system. I want to understand what he built. I want to know him the way you're getting to know him now. Thank you for finding this, Sarah. Thank you for not giving up. Sarah set down her phone and looked around the study one final time before heading to bed. Tomorrow, Michelle would arrive. Tomorrow, Morrison and Burke would file the first claims. Tomorrow, the world would begin learning that Thomas Chen's obsession had been love made visible. But tonight, alone in the house where her father had lived and worked and died, protecting his daughter's future, Sarah felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. She wasn't broken. She wasn't a failure. She was the daughter of a brilliant, devoted man who'd built something extraordinary and trusted that someday, somehow, his daughters would find it and understand. Thank you, Dad, she whispered to the filing cabinets, to the photographs, to the 43 years of careful work that surrounded her. Thank you for never giving up. Thank you for believing we'd find it. Thank you for loving us enough to spend your whole life protecting us. The house settled around her with its familiar creaks and sighs, and Sarah imagined it was her father's response, acknowledging from wherever he was that she'd finally understood, that the message he'd died trying to deliver had finally been received. She climbed the stairs to her childhood bedroom, exhausted and exhilarated, and fell asleep thinking about Depression-era securities and patient immigrant investors and filing systems that held fortunes. She dreamed of her great-grandfather standing in front of the stock exchange, of her father organizing drawers with meticulous care, of herself and Michelle standing together in a study full of proof that the Chen family had always been extraordinary. They'd just been patient enough to let the world catch up. Underscore underscore 6 months later, the conference room at Morrison and Burke occupied the entire 43rd floor of their San Francisco high-rise. Glass walls offering views of the bay that seemed designed to remind visitors that success was measured in altitude and perspective. Sarah sat at the massive table, Michelle beside her, while Catherine Morrison reviewed a spreadsheet that detailed every settlement, every pending claim, every dollar recovered from the Chen family portfolio. Total settlements to date, $87,400,000, Catherine announced, her voice carrying satisfaction that suggested even she had been impressed by how quickly some companies had folded. Outstanding claims estimated value, $109,600,000. We're ahead of schedule and above initial valuation projections. Sarah looked at the numbers, still struggling to fully process that these amounts, numbers she'd once thought existed only in movies or lottery fantasies, now described her actual financial situation. In 6 months, she'd gone from worrying about rent to having more money than she could conceivably spend in multiple lifetimes. Union Pacific settled yesterday, James Burke added. Full value plus interest calculated back to 1893. They fought hard initially, claimed the bonds had been redeemed during the 1940s consolidation. But your father's documentation was irrefutable. They found their own records confirming the bonds remained outstanding. $32 million, paid within 90 days. Michelle shook her head slowly, still processing despite months of watching settlements roll in. Dad was sitting on bonds worth $32 million, and he kept working as an insurance adjuster, kept living in that modest house, kept wearing the same suits until they wore out. He was protecting you, Catherine said simply, making sure everything was authenticated properly before passing it on. That kind of discipline is rare. The meeting continued for another hour, reviewing ongoing litigation against companies still fighting their obligations, discussing strategy for the remaining claims, planning for tax implications that would still leave the Chun sisters with generational wealth even after government took its share. When it finally ended, Sarah and Michelle stood at the glass wall, looking out over San Francisco while attorneys and paralegals bustled behind them, already moving to their next cases. I keep thinking about what we would have destroyed, Michelle said quietly, if you'd listened to me about throwing away the filing system. If Karen had convinced you Dad was just mentally ill. If you'd given up after looking through a few drawers. But I didn't. We didn't. Because you're more like Dad than I ever was. Patient enough to look deeper, thorough enough to follow through, stubborn enough to ignore everyone saying you were wasting your time. Sarah turned from a view to look at her sister. 6 months had changed Michelle almost as much as it had changed her bank accounts. She'd quit her demanding job in Singapore, moved back to California, spent weeks in their father's study, reading through his research and journals and unsent letters. The sister who'd once dismissed Thomas Chen's filing system as hoarding now defended it as genius to anyone who'd listen. The Sacramento Bee article comes out tomorrow, Sarah said. Victoria Park finished the draft. She sent it to me for approval yesterday. How is it? Beautiful. She interviewed Walt Hutchkins about immigrant investment patterns during the Depression. She talked to Robert Phillips about Dad's authentication work. She even found one of Dad's college professors who remembered him as exceptionally detail-oriented. The article portrays Dad exactly as he deserves. Brilliant, devoted, visionary. Michelle's eyes glistened. Good. He deserves that. He deserves for people to understand he wasn't broken. They left Morrison and Burke's office and walked through San Francisco's financial district. Two sisters who'd inherited not just money, but understanding, not just certificates, but connection to family history spanning continents and centuries. They ended up at the ferry building, watching boats cross the bay while tourists and locals moved around them in the constant flow of urban life. What are you going to do with your share? Michelle asked. Sarah had thought about this question constantly for months. $87 million already settled, split between two sisters, meant each of them had access to wealth that redefined possible. I'm setting up a foundation, the Chen Family Heritage Foundation. It'll fund financial literacy programs in immigrant communities, teach people about investment, about patience, about building generational wealth the way great-grandfather did. Dad would love that. And I'm buying his house. Not tearing it down, not renovating it beyond what's necessary. I'm going to preserve his study exactly as it was, filing cabinets and all. Turn it into a small museum showing how he documented everything. Show people what devotion looks like when it's expressed through organization. Michelle nodded slowly. Can I help? With the foundation and the museum? I don't want to just spend the money. I want to honor what Dad built, what his father built, what great-grandfather started. I was hoping you'd say that. They stood together watching the water, two sisters who'd been given an impossible gift by a father who died before he could explain it, who'd left them not just wealth, but a story about patience and faith, and the kind of love that expresses itself through 4 decades of filing and organizing and protecting. Sarah's phone buzzed. Text from Robert Phillips. The Consolidated Edison settlement finalized today. $28 million. Your father tracked those certificates through 7 corporate restructurings spanning 90 years. Every company that tried to claim the obligations were severed found themselves facing his documentation. He won for beyond the grave. She showed the message to Michelle. Her sister smiled, tears running freely now. He's still protecting us, still winning battles he fought alone for so long. He was never alone, Sarah said. He had us. He had the future he was building for us. That kept him going even when everyone thought he was crazy. They walked back toward the parking garage where Sarah had left her new car, sensible despite her newfound wealth. A habit learned from a father who'd driven the same truck for 20 years while sitting on fortune. Some lessons transcended money. On the drive back to Sacramento, Michelle scrolling through settlement documents on her tablet, Sarah thought about the journey from that first afternoon in her father's study to this moment, driving through California sunshine with confirmed settlements totaling more than some country's GDP. She thought about Karen's pitying advice to hire junk removal services, about David's impatient demands for mediation payments she could now settle with the change between couch cushions, about all the people who'd looked at Thomas Chen's filing system and seen madness instead of method. But mostly she thought about her father, working alone in his study while the world dismissed him, protecting something precious while everyone assumed he was wasting his life, building a fortune and a legacy one meticulously labeled drawer at a time. When they reached Sacramento, Sarah drove past her apartment building and continued to her father's house. Her house now, purchased with settlement money that represented a tiny fraction of the fortune he'd preserved. The neighborhood looked different now. News of the Chen family settlements had spread, transforming Thomas Chen from that crazy hoarder into that brilliant investor in the collective memory. Karen had apologized profusely, had brought casseroles weekly, had asked if she could write a neighborhood newsletter article about Thomas's investment philosophy. Sarah had politely declined. Some stories belonged to family, not to neighbors who judged before understanding. Inside, the study looked exactly as Thomas Chen had left it. Sarah had refused to change anything, preserving even the dust patterns on surfaces he'd touched regularly and those he'd left alone. The filing cabinets stood like monuments, their labeled drawers holding the evidence of devotion that had been mistaken for disease. Michelle ran her hand along the cabinets. When a museum opens, what should we call it? The Thomas Chen Documentation Center, or maybe just the Patient Man's Archive. Sarah smiled. Dad would probably prefer something more technical and boring. Historical Securities Authentication Repository, or something. Whatever we call it, it needs to tell his story right. Not just about the money, about the love that made him organize it this way, about the faith that kept him working when everyone said he was wasting his time. They spent the evening in the study, reading through documents they'd read before, finding new appreciation for details they'd missed, understanding more deeply with each review how extraordinary their father's work had been. Sarah found another unsent letter, this one dated just weeks before his diagnosis. My daughters, by the time you read this, I'll finally have explained everything. I'll finally have shared the secret I've protected for so long. You'll understand why I spent so many hours in this study, why I organized everything so carefully, why I seemed distant sometimes. It wasn't that I didn't love you. It was that I loved you so much I wanted to give you something perfect, something complete, something you could trust absolutely. I wanted to be certain before I gave you hope. I wanted you to inherit confidence, not anxiety. I wanted you to know, beyond any doubt, that your great-grandfather's faith was justified, that your grandfather's protection was warranted, that your father's obsession had purpose. Soon, very soon, you'll know everything. And I hope, when you do, you'll understand that everything I did was for you. Everything. Always. With all my love, Dad. Sarah read the letter aloud to Michelle, both of them crying by the end. They held each other in their father's study, surrounded by the filing cabinets that had preserved his love and their inheritance, understanding finally and completely that Thomas Chen had been exactly what a father should be, someone willing to sacrifice recognition and understanding in life so his daughters could have security and knowledge in his death. He gave us everything, Michelle whispered. Not just the money. The proof that love can look like filing cabinets and labels and 40 years of patience. The knowledge that faith matters, that thoroughness matters, that protecting what you build is as important as building it. He gave us himself, Sarah agreed. The whole story. Not just the certificates, but the journey. Not just the fortune, but the philosophy that created it. They stayed late into the night, two sisters in their father's study, reading his research and journals and letters, learning who Thomas Chen had really been beneath the eccentricities that had hidden his brilliance from casual observation. By the time they finally left, Sarah had made another decision. I'm going to write a book, she announced as they locked up. About Dad, about great-grandfather Chen Wei, about patience and faith and building generational wealth through discipline and vision. About how what looks like madness from outside might be wisdom from inside. About how love isn't always expressed in words. Sometimes it's expressed in filing systems. I'll help you research it, Michelle said immediately. Dad left us hundreds of documents. We have his voice, his words, his process. We can tell the whole story, and we'll dedicate it to him. For Thomas Chen, who spent his life protecting his daughters and died before they could thank him. This book is our thank you, 40 years late, but infinite in gratitude. Underscore. One year later. The Chen Family Heritage Foundation opening the crowd filled every seat in the conference center. Hundreds of people gathered to witness the official launch of a foundation built on Depression-era securities and modern recognition of an immigrant's vision. Sarah stood at the podium, Michelle beside her, looking out at faces representing media, financial historians, securities experts, immigrant advocacy groups, and Sacramento residents who'd known Thomas Chen and wanted to understand the man they dismissed. My father died, believing his life's work might never be understood, Sarah began, her voice steady despite emotion. He spent 43 years documenting and protecting a fortune that 3 generations of Chen family men had built through patience and faith. He died trying to tell my sister and me where to find it, but morphine and cancer made his words unclear. We almost missed it. We came within days of throwing away $200 million because we thought his filing system was hoarding, his obsession was illness, his careful organization was symptom of mental decline. She paused, letting the crowd absorb how close the Chen family had come to destroying their inheritance through misunderstanding. But we found it. We found the bottom drawer my father referenced in his final words. We found the certificates, the authentication documents, the research spanning decades. We found proof that Thomas Chen was brilliant, not broken. And in finding it, we found him, the real him, the one hidden beneath eccentricities that protected something precious. Michelle stepped to the microphone. The Chen Family Heritage Foundation exists because our great-grandfather Chen Wei believed in America's future when Americans themselves had lost faith. He bought during the Depression when others were selling in panic. He accumulated slowly and protected carefully. He passed that portfolio to his son, our grandfather, who protected it through wars and recessions. Our grandfather passed it to our father, Thomas, who spent his entire adult life authenticating every certificate, documenting every corporate succession, building a case so thorough that major corporations couldn't deny obligations they'd hidden for decades. Today, Sarah continued, we announced the Foundation's first initiatives, financial literacy programs in immigrant communities across California, scholarships for children of immigrants studying finance and business, and the Thomas Chen Documentation Center opening next month in our father's preserved study, showing how patience and thoroughness and love can build something extraordinary. The audience erupted in applause. Sarah saw Robert Phillips in the third row, crying openly. She saw Catherine Morrison and the Morrison and Burke team who'd fought their legal battles. She saw Victoria Park from the Sacramento Bee, whose article had told their story to the world and generated enough interest that publishers were competing for rights to the book Sarah was writing. In the front row, she saw Karen and several other neighbors who'd pitted Thomas Chen, who'd called his work hoarding, who'd suggested he needed mental health intervention. They were applauding now, celebrating him now, understanding now what they'd missed while he was alive. After the formal presentations, during the reception, people approached Sarah and Michelle constantly, wanting to share stories about Thomas, asking questions about the Chen family philosophy, requesting investment advice, as if inheriting $200 million made them experts rather than lucky. Sarah answered patiently, channeling her father's thoroughness, but what she really wanted to tell them was simpler than investment strategy or documentation technique. She wanted to tell them that love looks different for different people, that what seems like madness might be devotion, that patience matters more than speed, and that the things we dismiss might be the things that save us. Robert Phillips found her during a quiet moment. Thomas would be so proud, not just of the money. He never cared about that for himself, but of what you're building with it. The foundation, the museum, the book. You're honoring his work in ways he never imagined. He imagined, Sarah corrected gently. He imagined my sister and me understanding what he'd done, appreciating the work instead of dismissing it, using the fortune to help others the way great-grandfather's patience helped us. He imagined all of this. He just didn't imagine he'd die before seeing it. That evening, after the crowd dispersed and the media packed their cameras and the last well-wishers had shared their final congratulations, Sarah and Michelle returned to their father's house. The study was exactly as they'd left it, preserved now as a museum piece, every drawer labeled, every cabinet documented, every surface maintained as Thomas Chen had left it. They sat together in the quiet room, surrounded by filing cabinets that had held a fortune and now held something more valuable, a story about love and patience and faith that deserved to be told and remembered and honored. Do you think he knows? Michelle asked. Wherever he is, do you think Dad knows we found it, understood it, honored it? Sarah looked at the filing cabinets, at her father's desk, at the photograph of Chen Wei standing in front of the stock exchange with his borrowed suit and patient expression. I think he knows. I think he knew before he died that we'd find it eventually, that his work would be understood eventually, that patience always wins if you hold on long enough. He held on for 43 years. And built something that will help people for generations. That's not madness. That's immortality. They sat in comfortable silence, two sisters who'd inherited wealth beyond imagination and wisdom beyond price, understanding finally that the greatest gift their father had given them wasn't the $200 million in authenticated securities. It was the demonstration that love could be expressed through filing cabinets and labeled drawers, that faith could build fortunes, that patience could create legacies, and that what the world dismisses as worthless might be the most valuable thing of all. Sarah's phone buzzed one final time. Message from Morrison and Burke. Final settlement confirmed. Total recovery, $203,600,000. All claims resolved. Chen family portfolio complete. Congratulations on honoring your father's extraordinary work. She showed the message to Michelle. They looked at each other, then at the filing cabinets, then at the photograph of their great-grandfather whose faith had started everything. Thank you, Sarah whispered, speaking to Chen Wei and to her grandfather and to her father, to 3 generations of men who'd protected and built and believed when others had doubted. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your faith. Thank you for loving us enough to spend your lives building our future. We'll make you proud. We'll honor what you built. We promise. The filing cabinets stood silent in the gathering dark, monuments to devotion that had been mistaken for madness, repositories of love that had been dismissed as illness, proof that sometimes the things we're too quick to throw away are exactly the things we should have treasured all along. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.